They say children are closest to the divine, pure, untouched, and open to truths the rest of us have long forgotten. That's why when Elias van Dijk, a 12-year-old boy from Amsterdam, returned from the edge of death with a message no one expected, people were forced to listen. It started on a day like any other. The sun was out, the breeze was soft, and Elias was laughing, chasing his friends through the narrow brick-lined streets near the canal. He was known for his boundless curiosity, a boy who asked more questions than most adults had answers for. That morning, he wore his favorite red hoodie and talked non-stop about dreams he barely remembered from the night before. As the group of children neared the water, they dared each other to balance along the edge of the canal wall, a game as old as the city itself. Elias, always eager to impress, climbed up, arms out, grinning. But in a split second, a slip, a loose brick beneath his sneaker, sent him tumbling forward. There was no scream, just a splash. His friends shouted his name, but Elias didn't surface. The murky green water swallowed him, and with it, the innocence of that sunny morning. What happened next unfolded in terrifying slow motion. A cyclist passing by heard the commotion and dove in without a word. By the time Elias was pulled from the canal, his lips were blue, his body limp. Paramedics arrived and fought for what felt like forever to bring him back. Chest compressions, oxygen, adrenaline. Nothing worked. For 3 minutes, Elias was clinically dead. But just when hope was fading, his heart fluttered. One beat, then another. Gasps filled the air. He was alive. But Elias returned with more than just breath in his lungs. He came back with memories no child should have, visions that didn't fade, and a message etched deep into his soul. Something he said wasn't his to forget, but to deliver. Elias described those minutes of death not as darkness, but as light. Warmth wrapped around him, not in the way a blanket does, but as if the light itself was aware of him, embracing him like a long-lost parent. There was no fear, no panic, only stillness and an overwhelming sense of peace. In that realm, time didn't exist. He didn't walk or float, he simply moved. And then, from the light, a presence emerged. Not a figure he recognized from books or movies, but he knew instantly. This was Jesus. Elias said the presence didn't speak with words, but with thoughts that echoed like thunder and whispers all at once. He understood everything without being told anything. Jesus showed him things. Not heaven, not hell, but a world in chaos, trembling on the edge of something great and dangerous. Elias saw war zones, protests, burning cities, and then in the middle of it all, a man. Tall, proud, with fire in his eyes and dust on his clothes. He was surrounded by people, some cheering, others plotting. The name Ibrahim Traoré burned into Elias's mind like a branding iron. He had never heard it before, yet it felt familiar, important, like the name itself carried weight. Jesus conveyed something else, a sense of urgency. Ibrahim wasn't just a man or a politician. He was a chosen figure, a protector, a revolutionary with a destiny far bigger than his nation. In that space between life and death, Elias understood that Traoré's existence had implications for the future of an entire continent, and beyond. Elias said he saw Ibrahim defying powerful enemies, surviving traps and bullets meant to silence him. But just as strongly, he felt the warning. The attempts weren't over. Another one was coming, closer, smarter, deadlier. Elias saw shadows closing in, betrayal from trusted circles, and the faint outline of a weapon being prepared. He didn't know when, he didn't know where, but he knew it would be soon. And if Ibrahim fell, something terrible would be unleashed, something that would ripple through nations and rewrite the fate of millions. That's when Elias woke up, tears streaming down his face. screaming one name over and over again. Ibrahim. The doctors thought it was trauma. The nurses called it confusion. But Elias was clear. His eyes, once playful and full of wonder, now held a seriousness that made grown men uneasy. He begged his parents to write down what he saw. He described the man, the message, the feeling that he had come back for one reason only: to deliver the warning. And in the days that followed, every time someone tried to brush it off as imagination, Elias would point to news stories, interviews, and images of Traoré. "That's him," he'd say. "That's the man in the light, and they're going to try again." In the sterile white glow of the hospital room, Elias stirred. Machines beeped steadily, nurses whispered in clipped tones, and his parents sat by his bed with tear-streaked faces, gripping each other's hands in disbelief. But Elias, he wasn't crying. He wasn't confused or afraid. His first words, spoken in a raspy whisper as he opened his eyes, weren't, "Where am I?" or "What happened?" They were, "I need to tell you about Ibrahim." His mother leaned in, gently brushing the hair from his forehead, thinking he was dreaming. But Elias locked eyes with her and repeated the name, this time louder. He spoke with urgency, recounting what he had seen, not as a dream, but as an experience that had more clarity than waking life. He described the warmth, the light, the man with determined eyes who stood at the center of a whirlwind, and the unmistakable warning he had been sent back to deliver. His parents listened, shaken and unsure, but unable to deny the conviction in his voice. When Elias asked for a phone to look up the name Ibrahim Traoré, his mother hesitated, then gave in, hoping it would somehow ground him in reality. But instead, it did the opposite. As the search results loaded and Ibrahim's face appeared on screen, Elias pointed without hesitation. "That's him," he said. "That's the man. That's who I saw." At first, his parents thought it might be a coincidence. Maybe he had heard the name on the news without realizing it. But Elias described things that hadn't been in any headlines. Details about the man's past, his decisions, the danger that surrounded him. It became impossible to write off as imagination. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He talked for hours, piecing together the puzzle of what he had seen with what he was discovering online. Each new article, each detail about Burkina Faso's young leader, seemed to validate everything he had been shown in the realm beyond. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just some obscure political figure. He was a revolutionary force, shaking the foundations of an entire region. Born in 1988, he had led a dramatic coup in 2022, becoming the world's youngest head of state. Elias read about how Traoré had seized control not out of ambition, but because his country was being torn apart by violence and corruption. He found out that Traoré had refused a salary increase for himself and his ministers, choosing instead to live on the modest income of a military captain. Elias lit up reading about the gold refinery Traoré inaugurated, which allowed Burkina Faso to process its own resources instead of sending them abroad for a fraction of their value. It made sense now. The fire in the man's eyes, the crowds in his visions, the mix of admiration and betrayal. Elias realized Traoré wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol. But the deeper Elias and his parents looked, the darker the picture became. Ibrahim had survived over 18 assassination attempts since taking power, a staggering number that pointed to just how threatening his presence was to the global order. Some were clumsy, others were sophisticated. Poison plots, ambushes, insider betrayals. Elias trembled reading about the latest one, which had occurred only days before his fall into the canal. It had been organized with terrifying precision. A group of military insiders, some of whom had ties to foreign intelligence networks, had planned to seize control and eliminate Traoré during a high-level security meeting. They had been stopped at the last moment, thanks to intercepted communications and a loyalist informant. The public only heard the surface version, but Elias knew what it meant. The timing of his vision wasn't random. The threat wasn't over. The next attempt would be worse, and if it succeeded, the consequences would spread far beyond Burkina Faso. He could see it now, as clearly as he had in that other world. The cracks forming not just around one man, but around an entire region standing on the edge of something transformative. Traoré's rise wasn't an isolated event. It was connected to Mali, to Niger, to the growing resistance against neo-colonial forces that had controlled Africa's fate for generations. And that's when Elias remembered something else from his vision, something that made his stomach knot. There were not only bullets and bombs aimed at Ibrahim, but words, contracts, and deals made behind closed doors, trying to strangle the future before it could breathe. Countries, corporations, and shadowy groups who profited from instability wanted Traoré gone. And this time, they would come not as enemies, but as friends. Elias began to draw the scenes he remembered. One sketch showed Ibrahim walking through a crowd with a radiant sky above him. His path lit, but shadowed figures flanked him on every side. Another showed a set of hands passing a briefcase across a dark room, with the shape of a sniper rifle hidden within. Elias didn't understand politics, but he understood danger, and the danger around Traoré was growing by the hour. His parents, no longer skeptics, began documenting everything, unsure of who to contact, but knowing this message was too urgent to ignore. They reached out to journalists, activists, and even tried to contact diplomatic offices. Most dismissed them, but a few listened. Quietly, cautiously. What began as a near tragedy in a European canal was now becoming a story that could shift global awareness. A boy nearly drowned and came back claiming to hold the future of a nation in his hands, and with it, the fate of a leader who had dared to challenge the world. And as Elias said over and over again in the days that followed, it's not about believing me, it's about protecting him, because if he falls, everything changes. Elias had always been a bright child, imaginative and thoughtful, but since the accident, something in him had shifted. He spoke less about toys and more about patterns in history. He paid attention to news from Africa, watching reports most kids his age would never care to understand. He absorbed information with unsettling clarity. But what stood out most was his unshakable focus on one man, Ibrahim Traoré. To Elias, this wasn't an obsession, it was a mission. Every time he saw a new headline, especially about the alliance of Sahel states, he'd nod and say, "It's happening, just like I saw." This alliance, he explained, wasn't just a military pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It was the beginning of a movement. A rejection of the old world order. A declaration of independence from external manipulation. Elias described seeing a map during his near-death vision, but not the kind you find in textbooks. This one was alive, pulsing, glowing, shifting. Borders were redrawn not by force, but by unity. The alliance shimmered like a constellation of nations finding their own gravity. He saw hands reaching across deserts and forests, not to ask for aid, but to build together. Traoré stood at the heart of it, not as a dictator but as a symbol of a new era. A quiet leader holding back a storm, guiding others towards something freer, fairer, more African. But with that hope came a deep and growing fear. In his vision, Elias remembered hearing drums, slow, heavy, growing louder. With each beat, the shadows lengthened. He couldn't see their faces, but he knew what they meant. He said the shadows weren't foreign troops or politicians. They were closer, familiar. Some wore the uniforms of friends, some smiled. That was the terrifying part. They weren't attacking from the outside. They were already inside. Elias described a scene where Traoré was surrounded by advisors. Some offered loyalty, others offered poison. Not literal poison, but poisoned ideas, poisoned promises. Deals dressed up as progress. Offers that would dilute the strength of the alliance or distract Traoré from his mission. And worse than that, Elias saw the glint of metal, a gun concealed beneath robes. A signal passed in silence. He knew another attempt was coming. One that would look like trust. One that would strike not when Traoré was fighting, but when he was resting, when he thought he was safe. Elias didn't know names, he didn't see dates, but he saw moments. A door closing too slowly, a power outage at the wrong time, a face in a crowd that didn't belong. He described one terrifying scene over and over. Traoré standing on a balcony, waving to a crowd below, unaware of the marksman hidden in a building across the street. He said the vision ended not with blood, but with silence. The kind that comes after something sacred is broken. That silence haunted Elias more than anything else. That's why he couldn't stop. That's why he drew, wrote, told his story to anyone who would listen. Not because he wanted to be believed, but because he wanted the silence to be avoided. Because if that shot was fired, the alliance would unravel. The hope he saw would flicker out, and chaos, real chaos, would follow. What made the warning even more chilling was how events in real life seemed to echo the rhythm of Elias's visions. More reports of destabilization efforts surfaced. Anonymous sources spoke of intelligence briefings suggesting foreign operatives were trying to infiltrate Burkina Faso's inner circle. Protests suddenly flared up in places that had been quiet for months. Rumors spread of a mole in the administration. Some claimed it was paranoia. Others whispered that it was calculated disinformation. But Elias knew better. He had seen the pattern. This wasn't spontaneous. This was preparation. And the worst part? He believed the shot hadn't been fired yet. The silence hadn't come. The vision hadn't finished. He would often wake up at night, drenched in sweat, and say the same thing. They're still planning it. When asked who, he'd only reply, the ones who hate change. That was his name for them. Not governments, not mercenaries, not rebels, but those who feared what Traoré represented. Because to Elias, Traoré wasn't just a president. He was proof that Africa could lead itself without begging at the tables of old empires. And for some people, that was more dangerous than any weapon. That's why the next attack would be different. It wouldn't come with loud explosions or tanks in the streets. It would come in quiet moments, in paper trails, in softly spoken lies, in betrayal wrapped in diplomacy. And Elias, a boy who should have died, carried this weight because he believed he had seen what most couldn't. Not the future in dates or predictions, but in paths, in warnings, in consequences. And he knew one thing above all else. If the world wanted to change, Traoré had to survive. Not just physically, but politically, spiritually. Because without him, the vision crumbled. And Elias hadn't come back from death just to watch that happen. The world is filled with voices, most of them speaking over each other, demanding to be heard. But every once in a while, a voice breaks through. Not because it's the loudest, but because it carries something deeper, something unsettling, something true. That's what began to happen with Elias. At first, it was a local curiosity, a boy who survived clinical death claiming to have returned with a divine message about a West African president most Europeans couldn't even name. Some journalists dismissed it as delusion or fantasy, but then came the drawings, then the timelines, then the eerie accuracy of events unfolding just as Elias described. He wasn't predicting lottery numbers or doomsday dates. He was revealing something that had the weight of inevitability. And what people couldn't ignore was how closely the real world was starting to mirror his story. Every assassination plot that failed, every strange political ripple in Burkina Faso, Every move Traoré made that aligned with Elias's vision, it built a case too compelling to ignore. Word began to spread, not from headlines, but from whispers. A freelance journalist from Belgium wrote a piece titled "The Prophet of the Canal," half critique, half confession that maybe, just maybe, this boy knew something we didn't. A West African diaspora group in Paris picked up the story and began circulating it among political circles, calling for greater awareness and support of Traoré's efforts. Activists in Ouagadougou caught wind of it and began referencing Elias's message in speeches, not as prophecy, but as a symbol. Even people who didn't believe in visions began to believe in the urgency. Because sometimes it doesn't matter where a warning comes from. What matters is whether it's ignored. And Elias wasn't being ignored anymore. His parents, still overwhelmed by the weight of it all, began carefully managing who could speak to him. Psychologists wanted to study him. Skeptics wanted to debunk him. But Elias didn't care about fame, attention, or proving anyone wrong. He only cared about the message. That obsession drove him to continue piecing together fragments of the vision he'd had. He made timelines with strings and pins, mapping out possible events and connections between players he felt were involved in the next assassination attempt. He identified moments of risk, state visits, national addresses, leadership summits. He pointed to signs of betrayal in the news, patterns in social media, shifts in energy that most people overlooked. And while his insights couldn't always be verified, they were unsettlingly prescient. But beyond the warnings and the fear, Elias also began to share something else: hope. He talked about what would happen if Traoré survived, not just physically, but in his purpose. He described a Burkina Faso that inspired neighboring nations to break their chains, to reclaim their resources, to build a future no longer shaped by foreign interests. He saw a future where education was rebuilt from the ground up, where children no longer learned under the weight of colonial narratives, but under the pride of their own history. He talked about unity that didn't require violence, and strength that didn't demand submission. The alliance of Sahel states, he said, was only the beginning. He saw it growing: Senegal, Guinea, Chad, joining not because of military deals, but because they saw something real in what Traoré stood for. A kind of leadership that wasn't about power, but about protection, about healing. And this, Elias believed, was the real reason the attempts on Traoré's life would not stop. Not because he was feared as a warrior, but because he was feared as a symbol. He didn't just threaten systems. He inspired people to think they didn't need those systems at all. That's more dangerous than any army. Elias said that in his vision, the world trembled not when Traoré took power, but when people began to believe in him. Because belief, true belief, spreads. It multiplies. It breaks down the walls that divide nations and pierces the illusions we've been taught to accept as permanent. As the weeks turned into months, Elias began to change again. Not outwardly. He was still a quiet boy in Amsterdam, going to school when he could, drawing late into the night. But there was something about the way he moved, the way he spoke. It was as if he knew he had already done what he was sent back to do. And that's when he started writing letters. Not to the public, not to presidents, but to Ibrahim himself. Letters that began with, "You don't know me, but I know you," and ended with, "Please stay alive. The world needs you more than it knows." No one knew if the letters ever reached him, but Elias believed they would. Somehow. And maybe that's the legacy. Not the message itself, not the miracle, not even the warning, but the ripple effect of one boy returning from death carrying a light so clear it refused to be dimmed. Because in the end, this was never just a story about a near-death experience. It was a story about how fragile hope is, how easily it can be lost, and how powerful it becomes when someone, anyone, chooses to carry it forward. Elias carried it, He still does. And every day that Ibrahim Traoré wakes up, every day he breathes and chooses to keep fighting, that hope grows louder. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but in hearts, quietly, unstoppably.